Hi everybody, I'm Susan John. ഞാൻ ഒരു മലയാളിയാണ്. ഞാൻ ഉണ്ടായത് വാഴൂരിലാണ്, way back in 1956, so you can figure out my age. അന്ന് my parents രണ്ടുപേരും മലയാളീസാണ്. പക്ഷേ ഞാൻ 6 വർഷമേ ഞാൻ നാട്ടിൽ ജീവിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളൂ. മൈ ബിഗിനിങ് നഴ്സറിയും ഫസ്റ്റ് സ്റ്റാൻഡേർഡ് ഒരു 2-3 മാസം മാത്രമേ നാട്ടിൽ പഠിച്ചിട്ടുള്ളൂ. അത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് I've been outside Kerala. All right, so I have been in the education field for 45 years, and our 45 years, 26 of those years have been in New Zealand. I am a high school physics teacher, and my last position was here in Auckland in a large school as the learning area director for science as well as the head of physics. Now, the reason why I'm doing this talk is with the hope of helping people who are thinking of going for a teaching job in New Zealand, or even parents who would like to send their children to a school in New Zealand. And I hope that some of the things that I'm going to convey to you will be of help in your decision-making role and moving forwards. Now, just a little history about myself so that you can relate to me. Why am I a teacher? Well, I spent from the age of 10, I've been in boarding schools. And I was in Bangalore in a school. And most of the time, children, my friends used to come to me and ask me to explain things to them. They said, wasn't paying attention in the class. അതുകൊണ്ട് ടീച്ചർ പറഞ്ഞതൊക്കെ, can you just say it once more in your own words? And this was good for me. I enjoyed it. Maybe that is what led me to a teaching career. So I am a graduate. I am not a PhD or anything. I'm just an ordinary person. I did my college from WCC Madras, and I majored in physics with maths and chemistry. Adu kayinja, after I got married, my husband was in the Navy, and when we were in Bombay, I was actually doing my master's in French at that time. Appa aa samayathu I couldn't interact with anybody who was a foreigner. So I had to abandon my French course, and instead of that, I went into teaching. And I did my B.Ed from Bombay Teachers Training College, and I have taught in many schools in Bombay. The last school I taught in Bombay was the Cathedral and John Connon High School. Before that, I've taught in Queen Mary School. And then with being a naval wife, my husband did get transferred. And my last stint in India was when he was in Cochin. And I taught in the Choice School in Cochin. And so it was while I was teaching in the Choice School that my husband thought it might be a good idea for us to come to New Zealand. So what did I do? So initially we were a bit reluctant to come here, but of course we picked up our courage. I didn't come to a job in New Zealand. But the first thing I did, or rather my husband did, was to make sure I had my teacher registration. So how do you get your teacher registration? You need to go online to the Teaching Council of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Why? Why is this important? That's because a school cannot employ an unregistered teacher in New Zealand. So the first step is to get a provisional practicing certificate. The other thing we did was we both did the IELTS exam. We did not prepare for it. We just walked into it because we were quite fluent in English. So that was all right. And we also actually had to send all our qualification documents to New Zealand, because what they do in New Zealand is they kind of find the equivalent qualification for India in New Zealand. So sometimes they might just recognize your Bachelor of Education as a diploma in education. It might be a step lower, but don't lose heart. It's okay. You've got your teaching qualification, so that'll be good. And again, some universities are recognized, some are not. They also ring your referees from here. Now, New Zealand, there is a shortage of teachers, and that is where I'd like to tell you what's really important. So the shortages for teachers are in maths, physics, and chemistry. In my capacity as the Learning Area Director of Science, I have interviewed lots and lots of people, and so I want to give you some tips of how to go about finding a teaching job in New Zealand. One of the questions you may have is, should you apply for a job while you are in India or in some other country, or is it better to apply for the job after you reach New Zealand? So in my opinion, I think the chances of securing a job are higher if you're here in person in the country. And the reason is you're actually competing against candidates who are already here. So when there's a job advertised, there will be lots of applications. And when the person is looking through the applications, the first thing is normally done is you want someone who's right here, because the demand may be within 2 weeks. You might want a teacher in a month's time, and that may not give you enough time to reach the country. There's no harm in applying if you're overseas, but chances are better when you are here. The other question you might have is, how do I go about finding a teaching job in New Zealand? So unlike India, ഞാൻ ഇന്ത്യയിലായിരുന്നപ്പം a lot of my jobs, I just walked into the school and I was hired on the spot. I didn't apply, you just walk in, your CV is there, you talk to the principal and they say, oh yeah, we'll keep you, here's a job. But in New Zealand, it's different. You have to actually go to the Education Gazette vacancies. So you can do that online. So you just go to educationgazette.govt.nz and search for vacancies. This is because every job has to be advertised in the Education Gazette for at least 2 weeks. And there's always a closing off date, and your application has to reach that school before that closing off date. So if your application has reached late, it may not be considered. Okay, so that is one of the things we have to keep in mind. Now, just to give you an overview of what sort of schools are there in New Zealand. There's lots and lots and different types of schools. There are specialist schools for specialist education for those who may be disadvantaged in some way or the other. There's also the Rudolf Steiner schools. But what is prevalent, the most number of schools are either state schools, so these are government-funded schools. They are not inferior in any way. There are what's called integrated schools, and there's also private schools. So state schools are government-funded schools. Integrated schools get some funding from the government, and private schools tend to be the most expensive because they don't get any funding from the government. They are private schools. However, if you teach in any school in any part of the country, your salary is the same. So it doesn't matter. If you're in Auckland, it doesn't mean you'll get more money. It's the same. It doesn't matter which school, which part of the country. However, if you're in a private school, you tend to get about 7% more salary in a private school. Okay, state and integrated schools, you get about the same salary. And a beginning teacher, a first-year teacher salary from, I just looked it up, from the 2nd of December 2024, your salary for a whole year is $103,086. You get paid fortnightly, and your gross pay is about $2,372 for 2 weeks, but that may not be what comes to your bank because tax is deducted at source. So you might actually get a little less than that when it comes to the bank. Now there's also, when you look at the schooling, 3 different types. So there's the primary school where a child starts on the child's 5th birthday and goes into the new entrant class and stays in that school for the first 6 years. So we call it year 0 to 6. And for the first few months, when a child joins school, the child will be in a classroom with a teacher, maybe just a few students, just to get used to the whole idea of going to school. They're very excited on their 5th birthday. Once you finish year 6, the child often moves to an intermediate school, which is a bridge between primary and secondary, and that is only for 2 years. So that's years 7 and 8, when they're getting into teenagers. And then you have the secondary school. Secondary schools are known by different names. So usually if it is a state school, they are called grammar schools. So you've got things like Auckland Grammar, Epsom Grammar, and so on and so forth. If it is an integrated or a private school, it might have the name college associated with it. So you have things like Marcelin College, St. Dominic's College, St. Cuthbert's College, and so on. So the word school college is kind of loosely used, but they are secondary schools. Now, just to tell you a little bit about school terms and holidays. So in New Zealand, schools have got 4 terms. The school year starts in January and it finishes in December. So usually end January. Each term is roughly 10 weeks. You have 40 weeks of schooling in a year. But sometimes term 1 may extend to 11 weeks and term 4 may be 9 weeks. But it all kind of adds up to 40 weeks. Between terms, there's a 2-week break. So most schools get a 2-week break, but there are some private schools where there is a 3-week break for one of the holidays. They kind of make it up because every school has to have the same number of school days. So there is a little leeway for starting and ending, but terms and the holiday times are the same for all schools. Adukonda, if you want to fly somewhere to go on a holiday, school holidays are probably when the air tickets are most expensive. So it's easier to travel during the term time, but you don't want to take your child out of school at that time. So, okay. Now, the school examination systems or the qualifications. There are 3 possibilities. So most of the schools follow the national qualification, which is NCEA, and that stands for the National Certificate of Educational Achievement. Now, schools, there are 13 years of schooling in New Zealand, not 12. Okay, and in the NCEA system, there is what you call a end of year, what's called board exam or the public national exam in year 11, in year 12, and also in year 13. Okay, so there's 3 years of formal exams. Now, there are schools that offer International Baccalaureate or the IB. These are mostly private schools because in order for a school to do IB, they need to have special permissions. People from the IB board, they come and take a look at the schools. They have to pay money. So it is not every school can afford to offer IB. Then there's also schools that offer Cambridge. Now, both state schools, integrated schools, and private schools do offer Cambridge. So, by and large, the majority of the schools offer NCEA. The other thing that might interest you is, what do I do to get a teaching job? So, some suggested steps towards securing a teaching job in New Zealand. One of the important things is this is an English-speaking country. Children are speaking English in the house. So we need to have a very good command of the English language. So we have to be fluent English speakers. We also need to be able to communicate in simple language the content that we are trying to teach. In New Zealand, every teacher in a school is given a laptop. And every 3 years you get a new laptop. It's actually a loan laptop from the government or from the school, so it's not yours to keep, but for you to use while you're in that teaching job in a school. So you need to be able to use a laptop or a computer. The other tip is etiquette. So it's quite nice to know when you are in a big group, the correct way of talking to people, how, your mannerisms, your behavior, all that's important. Eating at a table, using a fork and a knife and not chewing with your mouth open. These little things are all little tips that are important that do get noticed. The other thing I would suggest and recommend is to get really familiar with the New Zealand curriculum for your specialist subject. So how do you go about that? So I would suggest you go onto the NZQA website. So the address is nzqa.govt.nz, and you go into that and you go onto the subjects. You choose your specialist subjects and you look at what's called the achievement standards. So that gives you an overview of what is expected to be taught in a school. That's only the beginning step. The other thing you need to do before you actually even go into thinking of teaching is get familiar with the content of that subject. So lots of things may be the same as India. Few things may be different. But I would suggest go to a library, because libraries have books and they are free in New Zealand. You can borrow up to 24 books, I think, but get familiar with the content. So when you go for an interview, you at least appear knowledgeable about the subject that you are applying for. Okay, so the other thing that you could do for starters is, once you are registered, provisionally registered, do some relief teaching. So I'm going to talk to you about what is relief teaching. So once you're in the country, you get your CV ready and you ring up some of the schools not too far from where you live and ask to talk to the relief coordinator. So there will be one person in the school, could even be a deputy principal or another person in the admin, who is the relief coordinator. Give your name, send your CV, and say you would be interested in doing some day-to-day relief work in that school. So what is day-to-day relief? This is what happens. Human beings sometimes need to take time off work. For some reason or the other, you could fall ill, you might be having a doctor appointment, or somebody may have to attend a funeral, or for some reason, or your child might be sick. So when a teacher is away from school, what schools do in New Zealand is they get hold of a relief teacher and bring that relief teacher in for the day. So that's where you come in. It's quite interesting. So all that you have to do, the work will already be set for the class. You need to come to the school and they will tell you where to find the work for that particular class or classes for the whole day, and you supervise the class. Now, this is your first footstep or step into a school. So when you're doing that, you want to make yourself seen, you want to make yourself known to the others, and one way of doing that is to do a good job of doing the relief teaching. So how do you do a good job? So make sure you dress smartly and you go into the class and you will tell the students, either write it on the board, what is expected of them in that class, because you'll have the relief teachers, the teachers in all the instructions of what's supposed to be done that lesson. And then I would suggest don't just sit on the teacher's chair the whole period. Get interactive with the students. Walk around the class, see if someone needs help. There might be some students who can just get on with it. Some students might take advantage because you're not their regular teacher. They might talk to the person next to them. You just go quietly to that student. So you don't call out from the front of the class because you don't want to embarrass that student. So little things are important here. You go to the child and say, can I help you? Is there something that you don't understand about today's work? Sometimes, so try and do that. Go around the class, be interactive with them. Yes, it doesn't mean you have to go around the class the whole 50 or 60 minutes of the lesson. Sit a little bit, walk around. Okay, so that's a good way. And then as a relief teacher, it's also important you are seen by others in the school. So schools have morning interval and lunch times. So I would suggest go to the staff room and introduce yourself to other people. And so they know you. And then once the school has seen you and they see that you are a warm, friendly person, it's quite a nice, they might call you back again. And there have been instances when they like a relief teacher so much that you kind of go on top of the relief teacher list. So sometimes, or quite often, you may be the first person they're calling. They might call you the night before. They might book you a couple of days in advance if they know. Or sometimes they might even just call you at 6 o'clock in the morning if there's an emergency. So you just have to be prepared to go if you're ready for it. If it's not convenient to you, then just say, sorry, I can't do today, but I'm available any day. Or you can even tell them, I live a bit far away. Can you just let me know the day before? And that'll work. So you can tell them that. So that's about relief teaching. Now, there are different types of jobs that's available to be done in schools. So I'm going to tell you about different roles of teaching jobs. So I'm going to talk about the different possible type of jobs a school could advertise in the Education Gazette. So they will not advertise for a day-to-day relief teacher. That is what you have to get in touch. You have to be proactive and get in touch with the relief coordinator. But there could be what's called a fixed-term relief position. So that is usually when a teacher has gone on sabbatical or has been granted a leave of, say, 4 weeks or 5 weeks of the term, and they want one person to cover all those classes, but just for a fixed amount of time. So that's called a fixed-term relief teaching, and you get a contract, and your job finishes at the end of that period. Then there's a second category that is called LTR. That's the long-term relieving position. So in a long-term relieving position, it's usually to cover something like a maternity position when someone's gone on maternity leave for a year. So that's a longer period of time. So you're there for a whole year. Sometimes what happens is somebody has a baby. They've gone on a leave for a year, and then they decide they want another 2 terms off. So sometimes these ones can be extended, but you have to reapply for that position. But you're at an advantage because you're already doing that job and you know what it entails. So that's the LTR. And then there is the permanent position. This is where the difference comes between India and New Zealand. In India, you usually are on probation for a period of time, and then you kind of become permanent if they're happy with you. In New Zealand, it is not so. If they advertise for a permanent position, you can apply for the permanent position, and your job is permanent from day one. So schools have a quota of how many permanent teachers they can have in a particular department. For example, if the science department can have 20 permanent teachers, then you have 20 permanent jobs for those teachers. One of those permanent teachers leaves or retires or moves out, then that permanent position is applied as a permanent position. Okay? But if suddenly there's a role growth and you need an extra class, then that may not necessarily be permanent. That will probably be a long-term relief or a fixed-term relief, because we don't know if that same class is available the next year. So permanent position is always replaced by a permanent position, and LTR is replaced by an LTR position. So that's the difference between India and New Zealand looking at permanence. Now, I've got some tips for you for job interviews. So one of the things is you have lots of jobs applied, and let's say you make it to the shortlist and they have called you for an interview. So here are some things. So be on time. Try and get there at least 5 minutes early. And you go make yourself known to the front desk, the receptionist, and they will probably ask you to sit and wait a bit. Dress smart, okay? And usually you're interviewed by a panel of 3 or 4 people. And the panel normally consists of someone in senior management. So it could be the principal if you're applying for a high-up job, or if it is a normal teaching position, it's usually a deputy principal. You will have the learning area director of that area, if it is science or English or maths. And you will also have the head of that particular subject if you're applying for a specific subject. The other thing is, when you're answering questions, look people in the eye. Don't appear shy or nervous. They probably give you a glass of water to drink if you're nervous, but they'll put you at ease. And the other one is, when you're asked questions by the panel, listen carefully to the questions. There have been instances when people have answered a question and they have gone all around the question but not really asked what they were expecting to answer, and they kind of talk themselves out of the job. So just listen carefully to the questions and answer to the question. Another thing that might be useful is, when you've applied to a particular school, do a little research on that school. Like, find out, like, what sort of a school is it? What does it offer? What are the values of that school? What's the name of the principal of that school? So you can find all this information on the web. So it's nice to be knowledgeable, and just look at what extracurricular activities is the school excelling in. So that shows that you are interested in that school. And then when you finish the interview, shake hands, say thank you, and then you go out gracefully. Don't sound as if you're desperate for the job. You are good, you value yourself, you will get a job. Be confident. Okay, my next thing I'm going to talk about is, once you've got the job and you are in the workplace, I have some tips for you which might help you along the way in your teaching career. So one important aspect is the difference between India and here. Like, when I was teaching in Choice School was quite far away from where we lived. We lived in Panambali Nagar, and Choice School was in Tripunithara. And so there was a school bus that came. So the children and the teachers all got onto the school bus, and they all reached the school at the same time. And then at the end of the day, everybody loaded into the buses and they all went home at the same time. That's where New Zealand is a bit different. So teachers, like, they usually, you reach school, if you have your car, you drive to school. A lot of them just drive to school. Me, for example, like, the school bell goes at 8:30. There's usually a staff briefing at 8:15. I kind of reach, because of my responsibilities, not everybody does that. I used to reach a little after 7 o'clock, maybe 7:15, 7:20, because there is a lot of preparation to do. So you have to be a dedicated teacher. So the other thing, so you be on time, then prepare for your classes the night before. So in a senior school, every school has a different structure. Some of them may have 5 periods a day, some may have 6, some may have 7, depending on that school's timetable structure. In a senior school, you don't really teach every single period. You might get at least one period off, but you prepare for your lessons the night before, the day before, the week before. So you prepare. And the other thing is, if you are teaching science, there is always practicals involved. So the children like to actually not just be lectured to the whole time, they like to actually do things with their hands, because then they understand better. They need to be able to relate the theory you're teaching to how it can relate to real life situations. So you do not have to think of what practical can I do. Schools have lots of resources, and there should be a list of possible experiments which you may need to order from the lab technicians. So usually different schools, depending which school you're on, may only have 1 or 2 lab technicians that look after 15, 20 teachers. What they don't like is last minute requests. So that planning is really important. So on the odd occasion, you could have a last minute request, but don't make it all the time. Try and request for what you need for that lesson a couple of days before. If it's something they need to go out and buy, then they need more time. Like, for example, if it was like a physics experiment, like the ball and ring experiment, then you want to tell that the day before, and they'll bring it to your lab and they'll collect it. But one of the good things is, when you finish a practical activity, you need to train the students to put everything back in place. So that's your expectation. So don't leave your lab in a mess, because someone else will be using that place after you. The other thing which is important is you need to be seen. So as a first-year teacher, you just want to get what's right in the classroom, but it's also important that other people see you. Okay, the other thing that is important while you're working in a school is you need to be seen, so by the others. So go to the staff room, and there is morning interval, there is morning briefing, and there's also lunchtime. As a first-year teacher or a new teacher to a new school, you might want to get it just perfect in your classroom. So you might think, let me just use this 15-20 minutes of interval to prepare for my next lesson. You may do that once or twice, but at least one interval, just go interact with the other people. Because if you're just by yourself in your room the whole time, from the time you enter the school to the time the bell rings at the end, nobody else has seen you. You need to be seen by others, especially if it's not a permanent job as yet. And that interaction, teamwork is very important here. All right. So, and then the other thing that is there in the New Zealand school systems, which I didn't quite see in India, maybe it's there now, is every teacher has a small little pigeonhole. And that is a way of communication. So you need to check your pigeonhole. It will have your name on it, and it's usually in alphabetical order. So there might be a piece of paper, there might be some message from somebody, or your photocopying may get put in there. So that's something that you want to check out every day. Okay, now I'm just going to come back to some interview tips. So I've interviewed lots and lots of people over the years. Some interviews have gone really well. Some interviews in 5 minutes say, oh no, So here are some things, some questions that ask. I can't promise you that these will be the questions, but some possible questions are, why do you want this job? So, you've got to say, why do you want this job in a particular school? The other question would be, why do you want this job in a co-ed school? Or how comfortable are you in a single-sex school, in a girls' school or a boys' school? And another question is, tell us about a lesson that went really well. What did you do to make it really good? Okay, what was that one moment when you thought, oh yeah, it is so good to hear that comment from the student. What did you do? There'd also be questions like, let's say there was behavior management problem in a school. So what would your reaction be if a child is always late to the class? Because in a senior school, the teacher doesn't go from class to class. The teacher stays in that same room. If it's a physics lab, you're in your physics lab with that environment around you. And the students come to you each lesson. So the students are actually going from one lab or from one classroom to the other during the day. So if a child is always late, one of the things you shouldn't do is tell the child off in front of the whole class. You need to go to the child and do like a restorative chat, like saying, what happened? Like, can I help you? Do you know what's happening? What do the others perceive when you're walking in late every day? They're halfway through their work. So talk to the child individually. And yes, and the other question that could be asked is, what extracurricular activities could you help in the school? Because schools are big places. There's lots of things happening in a New Zealand school. So you have all the academic subjects, your math, science, English. There's a whole range of them, technology, but there's also lots of sporting activities and also little clubs that they have. You could have a knitting club, you could have a crochet club, you could have fencing, you could have debating, you could have basketball, netball. So it is an expectation almost that you get involved in some sort of sport or extracurricular. There might be gymnastic, rhythmic gymnastic, artistic gymnastic, trampolining, underwater hockey. The range is so huge. And you actually, when you get involved with this extracurricular activity, is you see students in a different light, which is different from in the classroom. And it's a good way to get to know them. And also there's drama and there's productions in the school. So there's lots and lots of ways you can contribute more than just the teaching. And this little extra contribution, that extra mile you go to, will help you in the long run. So it's the extra bits that you do that get you your promotions. It's not the expected daily ones. So the expected daily things you do well, you do it to the best, but just do this little extra bit and that helps you. So those are some of the tips that I can tell you about interviews. How is a New Zealand classroom different to the Indian classroom? So I've taught maybe about 14 or 15 years in India, or maybe more. Now, when you apply for a job, one of the things that people look at quite closely are your referees. So in any CV, you need references. When you're new to the country, your references will probably be people from the country you're coming from. So initially, when I came here, the only reference I had was from the schools I taught in. And those were all written references. And that is fine because you have to start somewhere.